Thank you to our show sponsors, FMC Pre-School. Hey everybody, it's Lyndsey Smith, your host. Our intro video there sort of trimmed off a little quick, so it's a good thing I was ready, I think. Maybe I wasn't. Okay, we'll fix that in a minute. We've got producer Kara on with us tonight, and so there may be a few little technical glitches, which, Kara, if you have to replay it again and it cuts me off, that's okay. But otherwise, until we figure that out, hello. My internet has been really, really good, but tonight it's being a little bit glitchy, and also the lights went out just before we went live. So I do appear to be in a bit of a cave, and I do apologize for that. But I am so glad to see everyone on right away here. We've got some fantastic familiar names. Yes, Warren Schneckenberger, finally a show about corn. You're welcome. And yes, and Peter Johnson is actually joining us as well, even though it is all about corn. Okay, so Kara, if you are queued up to play the intro, please do, because we do want to send out that shout out to Thank you to our show sponsors, FMC Pre-School, US Borax, and ADAMA Canada. While other sources of innovation run dry and fail to understand your needs, ADAMA is here to deliver, and we're all in on you. Talk to your ADAMA sales rep today. All right. We're going to make it all happen. It's okay. All right. So, of course, as always, head to realagriculture.com/agronomists. Tomorrow morning, you can let us know you watched tonight's program and get those CEU credits. And yes, and joining me for that discussion is Ben Rosser with OMAFRA and Olivia Noorenberghe, I hope I said that right, with Pride Seeds. So we'll bring in our guest for tonight's conversation. Maybe. Yahoo! Okay, it worked. All right, we're getting there. It's all going to work. All right, Ben, I'll start with you. Are we a little bit worried that spring is going to be cool and slow to get here? Or is it too early to panic?
Yeah, I think we're too early to panic here at this point for anything. Depends on the weather, and I can't predict the weather. I know that. So, yeah, we'll see what the next couple of weeks brings.
I feel like I want to predict the weather, but I'm not going to like it. Olivia, how about you? Do you feel we're in like a decent spot still to be planning ahead? No need to get too antsy yet?
Yeah, I think we need to, be ready for the unknown. Weather is something that we can't really predict, but we want to be ready whether we're planting, mid-April or later on if the weather becomes unfavorable and is a little bit wetter in the spring.
Mm-hmm. So now both of you are a ways from where I am, and I am just west of Ottawa. And it certainly feels like spring has absolutely no interest in arriving very quickly. Winter is taking its sweet time leaving. And I certainly know that Western Canada as well is maybe feeling like spring will never arrive. But it is true. The weather can switch pretty quickly and we could be in the fields here before we know it. So tonight's episode, we are going to talk a bit about, before we head to the field, or some of the things we're going to consider in that sense. But a lot of tonight we are going to focus on that very important first pass, of course, getting that corn seed in the ground, and some of the things that we can watch for and discuss. So one of the things, and of course I open it up to the questions in the comments. Bring it on, anyone. If you've got some questions for our guests, please add them in the chat. Ask early, we'll try and get to all of them. But I'm going to start with, of course, it is corn. What is the more important thing, the picket fence or the consistent emergence? Ben, I'll start with you. Which team are you on?
Yeah, so I think there's been lots of work done, Ontario and North America, that's really shown if you're going to put a dollar either way, I think both have some impact on yields, but uniformity in emergence and staging as that crop develops is much, much more, from a yield perspective, important than that picket fence stand within reason.
Okay. Within reason. Well, okay. So what is within reason? Where does that sort of fall apart?
Well, I think if you've got a reasonably set up plant and you're getting reasonable spacing, I don't think it's you necessarily have a lot to worry about. I mean, if you're dropping pockets of 4 seeds with 2 feet in between them, it's going to be an issue. But yeah, I think if you have a reasonable setup, yield loss from spacing is fairly minimal compared to uniform emergence.
All right, Olivia, do you agree, or should we start the evening off with a bang?
No, I would tend to agree with that. Like, I think, so if you go to, actually, I have a slide on slide 5, Kara.
It'll just take a minute. She's got to find it.
Yeah, no worries. This is just kind of a picture, depicting, we do have some of those like spaces where there's no plants, but also there's quite a few plants that are, maybe 1 to 2 leaf behind in staging. And that can really have an impact on our yield. So, if you think there's 5 plants in there, let's say 5 plants per acre at, maybe a 6 bushel yield loss, that adds up to, 30 bushels per acre. And then when you're multiplying that by the price of corn, or let's say $6.50, that can be a substantial impact on our bottom line per acre. So definitely agree with Ben. More so that timing is more important. Not that, that picket fence isn't important as well, but it is going to have more of an impact.
I heard that corn was going back down to $4. Just kidding. Anyway, I didn't actually hear that. I'm just doing that to make Warren's head explode, and maybe get some people on side to on Pete's team with wheat. Just kidding. Okay, but it is pretty remarkable to me, the impact. So last week's show was on canola, and canola is this incredibly plastic, very can compensate for all sorts of things kind of plant. And then there were questions about can we get more consistency out of our canola like we have in corn? So the question is, or what I find fascinating about corn, is that something like that, like, the spacing or our consistency a leaf stage behind, can have a huge impact on sort of our yield potential and what we end up with. But managed correctly, I mean, corn is just, I get why people love growing it, because it is just so exciting. You can hear it grow. It can just knock the yields out of the park, and it's really quite remarkable. So that was something I'd never experienced till I moved out here, was when you can hear it growing. And yes, Warren, I'm the sheep lady. Okay. So let's back it up a little bit, because we want to talk about sort of how we get to that very consistent, that even emergence, trying to keep everything emerging at the same time. So Ben, I know we've talked before, and in the corn school we go through and we talk about planting depth. And so do we do a good job at getting to the ideal depth? And is there an ideal depth, or is it the proverbial it depends?
Yeah, so I think there's probably there's a spot you don't want to go any less than, because otherwise you start running into issues. Even if there was moisture, it's, I don't know, it would be maybe 1.25 inches. Like, no planter is going to plant exactly every seed at that setting, and you don't want to go shallower than that, because you can run into some root problems, standability issues, herbicide issues if you got maybe some soil applied. There's a range of reasons why you don't necessarily want to be less than that. So the other question is, how deep can you safely plant without issues? Obviously the number one thing is get consistently into moisture, all seeds into moisture, so they all germinate and develop at a similar rate, so we can get that uniform emergence and uniform development. How deep do you go? Certainly, 2, maybe 2.5 inches. I know there's been some work in the province. I think Mazex in particular did a bunch looking at 3-inch corn. And I think their message was that, on medium or lighter textured soils, they didn't seem to have a lot of risk in their trials for going as deep as 3 inches in some cases. So if it's something you're comfortable with or you have experience with, maybe that's an option too. Certainly if the risk didn't seem to be there as much if you were trying to make sure you got consistency into moisture per se. I think on some heavier sites, maybe it was a bit more of an issue, but into moisture obviously is number one.
So Olivia, if our aim then is into moisture, and I mean, does it make you nervous to hear a farmer aiming for a 3-inch depth, or are you very much on side? If that's where the moisture is, great, but even if not, is that not a little scary?
For me, I'm not fully ready to support maybe 3 inches, but I am a fan of that like 2 to 2.5 inch depth. Making sure we're getting into the proper soil temperature, making sure those conditions are right. We want to make sure also that when we're doing that first pass, that we're getting out and making sure that we're checking that depth, because in that first 100 feet, like that's where you're going to make most of the money of the season. So I'm not really a fan of, the 3 inches, but maybe the 2 to 2.5. And we want to make sure that we're being consistent and we are planting into that moisture. So making sure we're getting out and checking when we are planting.
Mm-hmm. Who was it who used to say it was smoke breaks that would get you out? Now it's you have to drink lots of water, so you have to go out for pee breaks and check. Anyway, I'm a much bigger fan of the second one, everybody. Save your lungs. Okay, Gideon has a good question. Ideal timing to plant after a pre-emerge application. Ben, maybe I'll start with you. What are we thinking about when we're doing our pre-plants?
Is this a herbicide question they're referring to pre-emerge?
I'm going to assume yes that it's a pre-plant herbicide. Yeah.
Honestly, I don't work with herbicides enough for no products specifically enough to really have much input on that, unfortunately.
Okay, Olivia, what are you working with?
So I think it does depend on what herbicide you are spraying, definitely. I did some work with, herbicides with my master's. I was looking at cereal rye termination prior to planting corn. So we were looking at a bunch of different termination times with glyphosate specifically, looking at, 2 weeks before planting, a week before planting, a day before planting, and a week after planting. So it also depends what you're kind of hoping to achieve there. With respect to a cover crop in herbicides, but making sure you're checking the labels as well for other specific, it depends what you're spraying basically as well. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. And so I did want to mention that, Olivia, maybe it's something we should mention because your name certainly came up. I don't know if your ears were ringing, but your name came up a few weeks ago when we were talking about spring termination of cover crops, because of course rye was a big one that came up. And so I did want to, if you're comfortable with it, I should hope so, if seeing as it was your master's project that got referred to. But we will talk a little bit tonight about termination of rye ahead of corn. So if anyone has any questions regarding that timing and those sorts of things, we will go over some of that tonight, but feel free to ask Olivia those questions as well, because that there was certainly a lot of discussion about your master's project and a lot of the work that you had done. So yes, hello to Alan. I think he's based in Winnipeg, so great to see you here. Okay, so I want to go back just a little bit to that early season and talk about cooler weather potentially. Peter Johnson says no ice on the lakes is supposed to mean it should warm up faster than normal. I have not lived here that long, but it's almost been 10 years, and 10 years is not long enough to maybe notice a trend, but it doesn't seem to make a difference, Pete, is what I'm saying. So what I do want to know though is, so let's say we do get a relatively good warm up, but things stay on the cool side. And I'm thinking about just a few planting seasons ago where we had some pretty cool weather, during the corn planting window. And we do with soybeans, we think about that first drink for the seed being cold and that cold water imbibition. That or I guess that's my question. Is that just as much or more of an issue for corn? Ben, I'll start with you.
Sure. So it's a tough thing to predict, right? I know kind of the traditional textbook answer is if you want to be conservative, there's a cold weather coming up. They're calling for snow, but conditions now are great. To stop planting 24 or 48 hours prior to that. That's kind of been the traditional textbook answer. That said, we had experiences like in 2020. I think it was, cooler start to the year, but soil conditions were great. Things were dry in the spring. I think it was May the 8th. We had a fairly significant amount of snow in a lot of areas. There were some growers who did the traditional thing and stopped a day or two ahead of that. There was other growers who kept on driving and ended up okay. That said, I think the one thing that really stood out in that year was that, again, soil conditions were relatively fit before that event occurred. So we weren't pushing into wet conditions or anything like that. I think the biggest learning in 2020 was that, where it was an issue was especially for those hybrids that are just known to be kind of weak early on. So when I talked to agronomists or we made the odd field visit, some of the hybrids that are just known to be susceptible to earlier season stress seem to suffer more. So I think one learning out of 2020, if you had an exact copy of that year again, was that if you've got some of those hybrids and you got that kind of forecast coming up, maybe leave some of those hybrids that are known to be weak until after that event. Get the other ones done first, if that works in terms of what farms you're going to and that sort of thing. But that'd kind of be my comments on trying to predict. Again, really tough to actually know what's going to happen ahead of time. But those are some experiences back in 2020 when that happened.
Mm-hmm. I'm just going to throw in here, Olivia, before I go to you, that Dr. Dave Hooker has entered the chat. And he says there's no relationship between corn planting timing and ice on the lakes. That one I would believe, Dave. I don't know about how soon it warms up or not. But if there's no relationship between corn planting and ice on the lakes, I could believe that one. Someone needs to make a very fun graph if somebody could do that. Okay, Olivia, I don't want to be that person that does focus on it. But if we do end up in a cool cycle, like Ben has said, or we've got that cool weather, how damaging, especially if we are looking at perhaps more susceptible hybrids, how damaging can that cold imbibition be? And when would we see evidence of it?
I guess it depends when it's happening in like prior to, or past planting. So let's say it's within the first 24 to 48 hours when the seed is first imbibing that water. That's when we kind of have that imbibitional chilling. And, with that, you might even get a dead, it'll basically look like a dead swollen seed. If we're getting it a little bit later than that and just getting those cold spells, that's where we sometimes see, that corkscrewing as well, after it's already kind of germinated. Which can make it difficult for it to emerge, and there's damage to the mesocotyl, which is basically the coleoptile pusher, as we call it. So within those first week, I would say you want to be monitoring what is the trend for the weather in that week after planting. Even I would say maybe that first 3 days is the most important, because you might get that imbibitional chilling, where the seed could potentially die from that. But it's still, a risk looking at the long-term trends and whether we maybe see some of that corkscrewing, and some issues with emergence and delayed emergence as well with those cold snaps.
So I'm going to assume as well, and Ben, I think you had a slide on this. I don't think we have it loaded, but I mean, the ideal corn planting window, we have time well into May that you can still achieve really strong % of yield, right? So we're not, if it's May 3rd and this is happening, it's a little different than it's May 25th and this is happening, right? So I think there are differences in areas when we get late in the season as to how much yield you give up. So can you walk me through it a little bit? I think it compared Ridgetown all the way to Elora, 3 different locations, and how your potential yield drops faster in certain locations than others later in the season.
Yeah, sure. So this is actually work that Dave Hooker and Greg Stewart and maybe some others that I'm forgetting had done 2006 to 2009. Data was developed to come up with a replant calculator to try to help drive decision making if you're trying to decide if you replant a corn stand or not. So date of planting is obviously a big issue for that, but it works nicely for looking at situations like this. Basically in that data set, you got to kind of mid-May and there was minimal yield loss at those 3 locations. But once you got past there, then you started to see yield declines. And it declined the quickest at Elora. So you would start to see sharper reductions in yield potential as you went beyond May 15th. It was a little bit slower at Exeter. So again, we're talking kind of north of London now at this point. And then at Ridgetown, that yield potential held on a lot longer than it did at the other 2. So it was maybe a week or 10 days later than to see an equivalent amount of yield loss at Ridgetown than what you would have at Elora. So if you're trying to make replant decisions, if it's a late season or deciding if you switch to soybeans, obviously that decision based on that data set is going to be a lot different if you were at Elora compared to if you're at Ridgetown.
Mm-hmm. And we could probably do a whole show on heat units and all those sorts of things. But and Warren says, so do we move? Is that what he means?
That'd be the
yes, Warren, you
simplest answer,
could.
yes.
Yeah, that's the simplest answer. This is what I tell my people that live still in Winnipeg. Do you know you can leave? Anyway, okay, so Dr. Hooker's got a great question about and wants to ask the two of you, what about soil temperature? So do we or should we be using soil temperature as a trigger to go and plant? So do we plant according to soil temperature? Olivia, maybe you can go first.
Yeah, I would definitely say that we want to monitor the soil temperature. We want it to be that at least 10 degrees Celsius for, that 3 to 5 days. I think that's very important, whether you're getting out there and, using your soil thermometer or doing the old boys way of checking it with your bare bum. We want to make sure we're getting out there and checking the soil because that's really important. That's kind of giving it its first shot, right? We want to make sure we're getting everything evenly emerged. If it's going to be cold and not optimal weather for that germination, we're not putting the corn off to a good start.
So Ben, do you walk around with the thermometer and say, okay, it's time to roll? Or is that just one other tool?
Yeah, so like you said, it's one other tool. It's not going to do much unless it's 10 degrees. It needs that to actually germinate and grow. That said, I think people probably don't pay as much attention to that nowadays as maybe what they traditionally did. Certainly I think there's cases where if ground conditions are fit, maybe we're not quite at 10 degrees yet, but the forecast looks favorable. I don't think there's a lot of people that necessarily would wait to start planting until it hits 10 degrees. I think something to take into consideration with forecasts and soil conditions, but I don't necessarily think it's maybe the trigger that I don't know if it maybe was in the past or, but something to think about for sure.
It also depends on how quickly can you get all your corn acres done. So
absolutely.
If you need some time to get them done, you're going to have to start a little sooner than maybe waiting for everything to be perfect. So yeah, absolutely. A good guideline. Yes, love the other ways we can tell temperature, Olivia. This is fantastic. So glad you mentioned that. Also, Sean Schill, shout out to the oat man himself. And he would just like everyone to know that oats don't mind a cold or cool spring, and you can even frost seed them. And now he shall show himself out. He won't though. Okay, so we are going to producer Kara, I think we will go to, and I'm glad Dave's on tonight because I actually pulled a clip from 2015 with Dr. Dave Hooker and talks about where we should be for average corn in the province by 2025, which is not that far away now. And then also talks a bit about that even emergence, but we're going to roll this clip with Dr. Dave Hooker from 2015.
Hey, we want to talk today about managing corn for higher yields. And let's just take a look at yield over the years. I'm seeing some statistics that says over the last 10, 12 years, the average cornfield is producing 4 to 5 bushels more per year.
That's right. 4 to 5 bushels per acre per year.
Per acre.
Which is incredible. Yeah. So if we stay on that same trend line in 10 years from now, that's about a 50 bushel yield increase, right? In 10 years from now, if we stay on that same trend line. So the average yield in Ontario would be 210 bushels to the acre. And I can live with that.
Yeah. Hey, question for you now. How much of that is genetics and how much of it is agronomics and management?
Well, funny that you would ask, because the plant breeders are saying, yes, that is all due to my superior plant breeding technology. They're taking all the credit, and the agronomists are saying, hey, that is due mostly to advances in agronomy from plant populations, fertility management, machinery advancements, tile drainage, and things like that. Yeah. But 65% is due to plant breeding. So some studies have been done comparing old and new hybrids using the new modern agronomic principles. 65% plant breeding and 35% agronomy.
Let's have a look at some of your work. You've been looking at a couple of those agronomic factors. The carbon copy stand, the picket fence.
Exactly.
And how important that is, as well as even emergence. How important it is to get that crop up evenly and going. So let's head back to the plot and see what you've come up with.
Awesome. All right, so assessing corn plant stands extremely important to maintain that yield potential. And there's three basic ways or forms that we can assess plant stand. One of the most important ones is looking at the plant population. Is the plant population what you desire, that final plant stand? And in this stand here, we have 34,000 plants per acre. If my target was 34,000 plants per acre, my planting job was great. Other factors that may influence that plant population, they worked out in favor of achieving the goal of plant population. The second factor is the plant spacing. So a lot of growers kind of determine the ability of their planter or the planter performance based on the plant spacing, okay? Plant population may be achieved, but a grower looks at the plant spacing. If they're uniformly spaced, picket fence stand, if that happens, the planter is doing a great job and we kind of move on. But there's other important things that we need to look for. If a plant stand is not acceptable, if it just doesn't have that picket fence stand, should we lose sleep over that? Should we update our planter? Should we spend $10,000 or $100,000 on a new planter?
Our sponsors for the Agronomists are ADAMA Canada, US Borax, and FMC Pre-School. Weeds constantly evolve, but so can your integrated pest management strategies. Knowing the latest weed pressures, resistance trends, application techniques, management strategies, herbicide science, and more gives you the tools for a proactive, agronomically responsible response. Go to www.fmcpreschool.com for recorded webinars from field experts and curated articles. fmcpreschool.com, your knowledge, your business, your success. All right. So, Ben, how did we do? What was our average yield in 2022 for corn in the province?
Yeah, so I had to cheat and I actually looked it up during there. So our OMAFRA one, I think it was 166. So we're getting there, but yeah.
Okay, well, in fairness, it wasn't.
Before we were 175, so.
I was gonna say last year is perhaps not a fair representation, right? And progress isn't always linear, but we've got a lot of ground to make up then in just 3 more seasons, really, if we're going to go to the end of 2025. So if y'all could get on that, that would be great. Because as Dr. Dave says, it's yes, genetics, but also it's management and our agronomy. So that's why we're here. These are the things we do. Also, sorry, Dave. Oh no. Bern Tobin looks 25 in that video. I can't believe it. Anyway, okay, we've talked corn generally. We usually are talking grain corn, but of course not always. But Kevin, who's out in the Fraser Valley out in BC, his 2022 silage corn crop, the last planted fields, which were late June, were second and third for yield. So my question, I guess, is, do the rules sort of all go out the window on silage, or is it like a whole other world? Or how do we broach sort of that balance of yield and maturity timing if silage is our goal? Who wants to start that one? Don't just jump off, all at once, guys. But yeah,
like yield and planting date, like we talked about with grain.
Yeah, like so. Yeah, so I mean, if we're obviously with silage, it is a different ball game, right? But does the window change significantly if we're talking silage versus grain?
I suspect, again, we haven't done the work. I suspect there's a bit more forgiveness. Like I know with planting dates and stuff, we talk about a bit more forgiveness because we're not, like you said, we're not necessarily trying to reach black layer. So there may be a bit more forgiveness. Now, June 20, now again, I'm not in BC, but if it was in Ontario, I wouldn't necessarily think June 20 is setting up for stellar silage yields. But unless there was other early season things going on in that year. But yeah, I guess that'd be my comment.
Mm-hmm. Olivia, would it make you nervous to be putting in silage end of June?
In Ontario, yes, I would. I kind of think so. Yeah, I'm curious kind of what heat units they're going and stuff, but second and third best yielding farm, that's interesting. Probably should do maybe some work more on the silage side of things. I think there's been a lot done with grain and yield according to planting date, but not as much with silage from what I know.
It is a different beast. I do want to point out, because everyone in Ontario thinks that Ontario kind of ends at Belleville. But Warren would like to point out that Dundas and Elgin, Dundas County, did hit the target, and the East did very well in 2022 for corn yields. So there you go. We can actually grow corn out here.
I think one thing that Dr. Dave was missing in his talk was, I think he said 65% genetics and 35% agronomy. I think he's forgetting about the weather aspect there as well. Like, I know it's something we can't control, but it did have a real big impact. Certain areas got timely rains. Others, missed every rain completely. We got really great solar radiation, but that precipitation aspect was really missing in certain areas. And even the most timely of rains, if it was only a couple, millimeters, did make a difference in some areas.
Now, he did hit on just briefly mention population. So I do want to talk about choosing your population counts in that, it is a curve. As you add plants, you can climb the yield curve, but there is, of course, there are economics at play and there are tipping points as well. So Ben, how do you walk through the process of, dialing in that plant population, let's say for max yield potential anyway?
Yeah, so I think I'd want to work with my seed provider. Hopefully they've got some good information in terms of sensitivity. I know all hybrids are a little bit different. I know the data that went in the replant calculator, there's a lot that kind of followed a general trend, but there were some outlier hybrids that were really, really responsive to population. So if you were below kind of what you're aiming for, yields would get hit a lot harder. And then there was the odd hybrid in that data set that was surprisingly flat across a lot of the populations they looked at as well. So I think that's where it'd be nice to have some of that background information from a seed provider if they have some of that. That's kind of where I would go if I was a grower, I think.
Yeah, I can speak to that.
We have Olivia here. Yeah. So how does that work? How do you go through that whole process?
Yeah, so basically we like to test our hybrids at different populations to see where are we going to maximize yield. Certain hybrids, they're able to, flex more. Maybe they're flexing in girth, length, or maybe they have a fixed year. So with a fixed year, maybe you're wanting to push that population. So when we are testing new hybrids to bring them to be commercialized, we're doing all these different types of testing, different populations, different soil types. How are they? What kind of environments do they thrive in? Where should they be positioned? So we are doing work to where should that target population be with our hybrids. So I would definitely recommend speaking to your agronomist. They will have that knowledge to provide to you based off of what hybrid you guys are planting.
So as a follow-up to that, Olivia and Ben, by all means, hop in here. But how often would you say are farmers like swapping out varieties? Is it or hybrids, like every 2 or 3 years? Are some always trying something new? I mean, the genetics move so quickly, maybe not as quickly as some, but pretty quickly. Is it, pretty common to be moving through and introducing new lines quite often? Or do we still have growers that are, please find me the last bag in the back of the warehouse of my favorite hybrid, and that's it?
I think it varies based off of farm and farmer. There's some farmers who they like to stick with the tried and true. I know there's one hybrid in our lineup that's around for, probably 8 years, and it's steady Eddie, and a lot of people love it. There's other people who look to, do plots every year and see what's new and what is coming down the lineup and what can we look forward to. There's definitely different mindsets. People who are willing to, take risks a little bit more and try what's new, but definitely other people who like to keep and rely on maybe one hybrid, or rely on that one hybrid and also, bring in another one into the lineup and introduce that, variability there, just so that you're kind of spreading your risk.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Okay. So Bern, I wish you were here a little earlier. Maybe you were and saw that video from almost 10 years ago. Back in the day. But Bern has a great question. And Ben, I put this to you because I think I know what this means, but I would love to hear it articulated in as many ways as possible. So we use that term, fit soil. So if the soil's fit, even if it's a bit cool, we might roll. So does fit mean optimum moisture? What does fit really mean?
Yeah, so I think practically speaking, we're talking, if we've got to do tillage, being able to do tillage without a lot of smearing or compaction, again, being able to plant without a lot of smearing, being able to close that trench. And again, I think what fitness probably depends on the grower, depending on your soil type and maybe what the calendar date is in terms of what you're willing to go out and do those operations. But yeah, I mean, in general, I think those would be the kind of things that we're talking about. The ability to put a good, open up a furrow, put a seed in it consistently, close it back up again without smearing. Again, if everything was perfect, but certainly not all its springs are perfect.
Yeah, exactly. So Olivia, do you have a trick for deciding if soil is fit? Because if you get out there with the planter and it's not doing what Ben just described, clearly it's not. So how do you sort of make the call on whether or not it's actually fit?
Even just taking like a ball of soil, if you can form it into a ball and it's not, falling apart or anything like that, soil is probably not fit. You should probably park the planter and wait a couple of days until it dries up a bit. Even, just kicking the soil, digging into the soil a little bit, seeing what's happening. You can even, try a pass first and check it. And you can usually tell within that first couple feet whether it's fit or not.
Mm-hmm. Although, as you mentioned, Ben, calendar plays a role in that the shorter time gets, the more we're perhaps willing to budge a little bit on what we want to do. Although I do wonder, if do people regret, and have you seen, especially in some of those tougher planting seasons, when you might have to wait a little longer than you're maybe super comfortable with based on the calendar, does it usually work out better or no? Because I feel like it could really go one of two ways, that patience could pay or you might kick yourself. So Ben, is it, do you pay for going when it's not fit all season long?
I think you could. Especially if you're on a soil type is not very forgiving, can set up hard and conditions after planting aren't good and they get hot and dry. Certainly you hear a lot of cases where growers did do some of that and then they waited in the better conditions and that field at the end of the year did much better. Waiting the 3 or 4 days to get into better conditions. Again, it's always a tough call to make in the spring. I think growers are kind of going to know what they can get away with on their farms the best. But yeah, obviously it's always a tough call. I think, planting date, where you are in that season, what your yield losses are for waiting, some of those things are going to come into play. And then again, how risky of a soil you're on. If you're on a really tough clay that's tough to dry out and couldn't really go backwards on you if you plant in the bad conditions, obviously different than beautiful, forgiving silt loam at the Elora Research Station.
Mm-hmm. And
yeah,
of course,
I would agree.
Yeah,
with
go ahead.
That. Yeah, I would agree with that. I cover basically the London to Niagara area and very different soils throughout there. And we also cover, Norfolk, so sandy soils. So definitely kind of depends where you are in your farm and what your soil is like, conditions and whatnot.
Mm-hmm. So Jason had an earlier question about the ideal depth and temperature. And Jason, if I don't get this right, please just clarify it in the comments. But is there a relationship between, there we go, planting depth versus temperature? So if soils are cooler, would you go shallower? Or does, let's say, time of year soil temperature play a role, or is it really about moisture and consistency?
I think, again, traditionally,
if
you're planting early, that traditional would be not to go too deep, so you're not going into really cold soil, and things will emerge a little bit quicker. Again, I think it maybe depends on soils and how deep you can go. Again, some of that work that Mazex did. Again, I wouldn't suggest that you plant 3 inches deep, especially if it's April 25th. But some of their work had suggested that on soils that can take it, going deeper in some cases actually gave you more uniform development, because while things were cooler and it took a little bit longer to emerge because we're going deeper too, uniformity emergence is better because they suspected there's less variation in temperature swings and that sort of thing, and more consistent moisture and temperature between those seeds. So I guess those would be all kind of things to think about.
Mm-hmm. Olivia, your thoughts? Does temperature play a huge role?
Yeah, and I believe BSF did some work with that a couple of years ago as well. They did different planting dates, and there was even one time when they were planting into the snow. And, it did kind of look like that 3 inches was promising. But again, 3 inches is pretty deep. We also want to make sure we're not doing too shallow, because that can lead to issues later on in the season, right, as well. You might get your corn that it's not able to establish roots. It'll be laying down later on in the season. So.
Mm-hmm. And we have some, Olivia, you did send some great shots of some of the roots. We could talk about those in a bit. But Jeanette's got a great question here for cover crops and delaying planting. So we have talked about sort of, if you've let your covers go over the winter and expected nature to kill them, they didn't all die this winter, we suspect. So there might be some issues of maybe having to plan a spring pass that you didn't have planned in the fall. But then we also have, of course, rye is a very popular one. And Olivia, you've done quite a bit of work on that terminating ahead. Ben, I think you've done some of these demonstration trials as well. Maybe if you can try, at least I know we don't have a ton of time to summarize, but did you find one best practice as far as rye, termination of rye ahead of corn? Was it okay to wait right at planting? When was sort of the ideal timing?
So, as we did delay planting, there were some yield decreases. But one thing that I found that was really interesting in my trial was we did look at some different planting patterns as well. So we actually planted the rye in twin rows versus 7.5-inch rows. And having that, rye-free strip, that really benefited the corn establishment. I think it was maybe partly better seed to soil contact, less of a response of, what we found was that the rye can actually act as almost like a weed with that shading response for having a low quality of light that's kind of reaching the corn plant. But having those twin rows showed some promise and kind of helped with those yields a bit. Throughout all termination timings. So whether you were terminating 2 weeks before or 1 week after, we were seeing a benefit to that. So that kind of something I would maybe like to try later if I continue working with rye and whatnot is maybe the benefit of strip tilling as well. That could show some promise as well, because that would kind of do this essentially the same thing. If you were doing that 7.5-inch rows, strip tilling, making that seed bed for the corn that's going in there, I think that could show a lot of promise.
And your thoughts?
Yeah, I guess from the question, I think it depends on what you're trying to manage with the cover crops. I've seen fields where growers had oats in, and you come in the next spring and you don't see a lick of oats. The field almost looks like a stale seedbed. Whereas other fields where you come in and it wasn't managed very well, and it got stemmy and big, and it's a big mat. So I think how you manage that cover crop has a big impact on terms of what you can get away with and the risks for planting the next spring.
Mm-hmm. So we do have several farmers, I think, that have already sort of been nervous that the the oats maybe didn't terminate on their own. If let's say they got away and you really stemmy, as you said, there's a mat, do you what would you recommend potentially to do ahead of corn planting to really set up that field for success?
Personally, I haven't managed many of those situations or worked in those, so I don't. I'm not sure I have a really good answer for you, Lyndsey.
Olivia, do you want to take a shot at it?
Yeah, at least with cereal rye, when I'm referring to that, I do think the safest timing is still kind of that 1 to 2 weeks before planting. I do think that's still probably the safest. If you're trying to optimize biomass, you can get away with a little bit later. But I would say probably that 1 to 2 weeks if you can try and get on the soil there. I also have some farmers, it also depends on your soil type. They wait until, the day before to terminate. If they have those heavy clays, I have someone in Niagara who I work with, and he terminates, the day before. And, Blake Vince down in Merlin, he can't get on his soils unless he's terminating the day before. So it does depend on the situation. I know that's hard to take because we want, one answer that's going to fit all scenarios, but it does depend on where you are and what your farm soil type is and whatnot.
For sure. So a comment here from Mark about too shallow on early planting, saying that the seed could see bigger swings in temperature. So the thinking there being that a deeper seeded seed might be somewhat more protected from temp swings. I want to, if we can, Olivia, I want to go to some of your slides, and forgive me, I don't know which one it starts on, but you've got some really great shots of some of the root development that I think would be really cool to look at.
Yeah. I think you can go to
unless Kara
12.
found. Oh no, Kara, did you find it? Yeah, there we go. It might be before this one, but we can start with this one. So I guess my question is, to set all this up, or this discussion up, is, how important is it to go in and actually look at where the seed actually is coming, or where the plant is actually germinating from, and how that development looks?
I think it's something that's really important, that we're going out. If we're seeing maybe some issues in stand right off the bat, make sure we're going out, digging up a few plants, because, this is going to tell us how we did as a planting. It's kind of like your report card for the season, essentially. Getting out, maybe digging up some of those plants, seeing what the planter did, see what we're doing wrong, because it's tough to know that we had an issue until it's too late. But, we're checking it now. So what can we do next year to mitigate this? And if we're not checking in on ourselves, we're not going to know, right? So definitely think that it's important to make sure we're checking our seed depth. And it's quite easy to do. If you actually go to slide 11, Kara, just kind of showing you how you're able to check. You want to go from the seed up to, where that soil surface is, that crown, making sure we're checking and measuring up to that point.
Okay, super cool. All right, we are just quickly, because we're rapidly running out of time. Producer Kara, if we could go to the last throw to our show sponsors, and we'll get into our last questions here as we wind down. Our sponsors for the Agronomists are ADAMA Canada, FMC Pre-School, and US Borax. Understanding the interplay of macro and micronutrients is important when choosing fertilizer products and agricultural practices. The ag team at US Borax are experts in boron's role in soil and plant health, including how boron deficiency can limit yield even when sufficient macronutrients are applied to the soil. Backed by decades of field research and lab studies, we can provide recommendations tailored for your specific soil solution. Go to borax.com/radio for more information. So I don't know if the two of you are following along the chat, but there are some discussions about how you would even get corn seed to 3-inch depth. And Warren seems to think that he'd have a hard time on heavy clay. And I think that's because it would be nothing but rocks being pulled up. But that's just my bazinga. Anyway, okay. Ben, I want to stick with this sort of root development and checking the job that we're doing. When would you say is the ideal time to go out and actually start digging up plants or looking at our root structures and evaluating the job we did on the planting path?
Yeah, so I think if planting depth consistency, I think anytime, it's always easier to find them when they're actual plants. If you're trying to look at crown root development and set and that sort of thing, were we getting sidewall smear or was there other issues, fertilizer burn? Typically those nodal roots start to set around V1 stage. So when we're putting out our first leaf collar is when they just start. So anytime after then, V1, 2, 3, 4, we would start to see our early nodal roots at that stage. But I think even earlier, if you're looking for seedling root issues like burn or insect feeding, honestly, I love digging corn up all season long. Well, maybe not all season long, but certainly the first half of the season.
All right. Okay, so you for sure traveling around with like a shovel or a trowel at all times is basically what
you should always have a trowel in your vehicle, I think.
Always. Okay, I like that. Yeah, Olivia, do you have a trowel in a back pocket anytime you're in a field?
Absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah,
I
good.
always do. Whenever you see maybe something that looks like a problem in the field, I like to get out there and dig up some plants, see what's going on.
All right. So Kevin is going to ask this, or Kevin did ask this, which I always think is fantastic. What happens if I put the seeds in upside down? Ben, what do I do?
Well, I guess if you are dent and down, it's just going to have to grow down the dent and then come back up and keep going up. Maybe a slight delay compared to if you'd put them all right side up. But I guess until you can find a planter that can plant them all right side up, probably not a big issue I'd worry about a lot right now.
All right. Oh, I think I'm freezing. This is a fun one. Yes, I know. This is why I always ask, is that everyone always talks about, we laugh that when we have lambs that have trouble being born, that the ram put them in wrong. So same idea about the corn. So there you go. Anyway, so all right. Yes. Dingo's if it's upside down. Oh my gosh. Okay. Everyone is just ready for spring. Okay. So we've got just a couple minutes left. Olivia, maybe I'll start with you as we sort of try to encompass some of what we've covered tonight. But we are, of course, gearing up for this very busy time of year. It's an incredibly exciting time of year. We're setting up for the whole season. Thinking about corn and corn establishment. When you're working with your customers, with your clients right now, what are some of the key things that you're going over to make sure they're set up for success right now?
So I guess one thing that you want to make sure we're doing is I want to make sure that they have all their planter maintenance done. We want to make sure we're ready to roll when that time comes, when we do maybe see those temperature fluctuations over 10 degrees in our soil after we've checked the soil for its fitness. We want to make sure that we're not slowed down just because we're still, working on those things. We want to make sure, I don't know if they have to do any tillage or whatnot, but making sure that the seed bed's fit for that as well, if that is something that you need to work into your operation before that. So making sure the soil's fit for that. And I think, the first step is kind of, it all comes down back to the soil and the fitness of it as well. So.
Mm-hmm. Now, Ben, we sort of started this whole discussion on, do we need picket fence or do we want uniform emergence? We want to aim towards that uniform emergence, which means we really do, to Olivia's point, be letting the soil decide when we go. A lot of the comments in the chat, though, certainly you're starting to talk about things like the planter itself and ways we might be managing residue with the planter and making sure that slot is closing, those sorts of things. So Peter says here, are there any comments on planter attachments to improve uniformity? So are the added things we can put on a planter going to improve the uniform emergence of a corn crop?
I think there's things you can do that can guarantee, you can consistently open a furrow to the depth you want. You can consistently get seed in the furrow where you want it and consistently close it up. So whether that's trash whippers, down pressure, any of that stuff that you need to accomplish that. If that's clearly an issue in your fields, then I think those would all be good investments if it's going to give you a more uniform corn stand.
Okay, and we have not really talked about fertility because honestly, that's its own whole show, likely. Really, if we're being honest. So there's a couple of questions I think that might stem around that, but honestly, it kind of is its own full program of feeding that plant throughout the season. So stay tuned. We will be tackling that as well. Although welcome any questions for sure. And Ben, maybe that's a question for you. I mean, you've been in this role now a couple of years. Are you seeing a lot more strip tillage in corn? Are you seeing a huge, or not huge, but a shift in the type of equipment that's heading across the field, either at planting or before?
Yeah, certainly. I think, like you said, strip till. It's been around since at least early '90s, maybe longer. But I think it's kind of been the last maybe 10 years there's been a real strong uptick in it. I think there's maybe a couple things. There's a lot more guidance on farms than there would have been about 2 decades ago or longer now. I think there's a lot of machines that are around now are a lot more sophisticated than some of the earlier strip tillers, which were maybe just kind of glorified anhydrous units almost in some cases. I think there's things like, and there were some funding programs in the province. I think that certainly helped get more strip tillers out there. But yeah, certainly I think that would certainly just been a strong increase in it. I still don't know what the actual acreage of strip till is in the province. Still it's relatively small, but yeah, certainly, the last 10 years has been a lot of growth in it.
Mm-hmm. Olivia, with your background in using, doing the research into rye and termination before, is that a big interest area for your clients when they find out that you've done a lot of that work?
I think people are definitely interested in it. There's definitely some more work that needs to be done to, mitigate those risks, because we were still, seeing some yield decreases compared to those untreated checks. There's definitely been some more success with soybeans. I know that OMAFRA has done quite a few trials, and looking at those early versus later termination dates didn't have as much of an impact on soybeans. But like I think Peter said earlier in the chat, corn is a princess. It doesn't like that competition, and sometimes cereal rye, whether it be the allelopathy or the light shading, it can have those negative impacts on rye. So there is definitely still some work that needs to be done before we successfully integrate it on every farm in Ontario or Canada. But yeah, definitely of interest, and still trying to make some things work and try things out with our farmers and see if we can get things to properly work on their farm.
Okay. I thought corn was king, but apparently no. Okay.
It's a princess.
It's a princess. I don't know. Is there any crop that is like super laid back, easy peasy? Maybe Sean Show would suggest oats, but I don't know. I've seen rust on oats that is very disgusting, and I feel like that's kind of high maintenance. So I'm throwing oats out the window too. So there you go. All right. Okay. So I'm gonna put it here. We are end of March. Ben and Olivia, you have both told me it is too early to panic, so I really hope you're both correct. Pete says there's no ice on the Great Lakes, so it's all going to warm up quickly, and we're going to have a wonderful planting season, and I really hope that's true. But we will check in later in the year and see how it goes. But Ben, thank you so much for joining us on the show tonight.
Thank you.
And Pete wants everyone to plant more wheat. All right. Thank you, Olivia. Thank you for your time. And of course, thank you to our show sponsors, to FMC Pre-School, to ADAMA Canada, and to US Borax. And thank you to producer Kara for joining me tonight. And to everyone in the comments as well, thank you for joining us tonight. Head on over to realagriculture.com/agronomist tomorrow to get those CEU credits. And next week, we are back and we are talking insects, aphids in particular. All right. Cheers, everybody.